All right, well, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for today's hybrid program, History at High Noon, Latinísimo. A few quick housekeeping notes for today. Please hold your questions until the end of the talk, and once our speaker is done speaking, we will ask your questions of the speaker over Zoom, and for those of you in person, we'll have a mic to pass around. All right, so let's get to the exciting part. It's my honor to introduce and welcome our speaker, Sandra A. Gutierrez. Gutierrez is the author of 4 cookbooks. She is considered one of the top national experts on Latin American foodways and the Southern regional cuisine of the United States. Excuse me. She has been awarded the Les Dames de, I'm going to mispronounce, Escoffier MFK Fisher Award Grand Prize Award for Excellence in Food Writing, and her work has been recognized as part of the permanent Food Transforming the American Table exhibit at the Smithsonian National Museum of American History. She lives in Cary. So Sandra, I'm going to turn it over to you. Welcome.
Hello, thank you for coming today, and thank you for those who are watching us on Zoom. I'm Sandra Gutierrez, and I would like to tell you a little bit of how the book came about, and then tell you what the book is about. About 30 years ago, I started thinking of writing a book for home cooks and on dispelling the stereotypes that surround Latin American cooking and Latin American people ourselves. But it was going to be a very long road for me to get from dream to reality. I was the food editor for the Cary News in the 1990s, and when I was first hired, I was a generalist. I was writing about ingredient-based cooking, about what my neighbors were doing, and slowly my column started growing to where I started doing profiles on celebrities. My very first celebrity was Emeril Lagasse, and he doesn't know, but he started a frenzy of people trying to get on the column, so he actually helped me a lot in my career. And after that, my editor came to me and she said, we've hired you to be a different voice, and you haven't done anything Latin American. And the reason was that on my first week of working at the Cary News, there was an angry call to my editor who said, why did you hire a quote-unquote Mexican to write our Southern column? So I decided that instead of taking that as an affront, I would take it as a challenge to become as good of a Southern cook as I possibly could. And I ended up meeting with readers and researching everything I could, meeting very famous Southern writers and authors and food writers, and perfecting Southern cuisine. So at that point, my editor said, you've got Southern cuisine. What about the rest, the other voices? And I said, I don't think they're ready yet. And she said, try it. And so my very first Latin American column was on Cuban cuisine. It was in the 90s. It was at a time when Cuban cuisine was starting to get noticed. And I didn't want to start with Mexico because, and this is where the book comes in, I've always said that Mexico is the front door to Latin American foodways. But it's not all. Once you cross over the threshold of that home, you will find 20 other kitchens inside that home. Wonderful, vibrant, exciting cuisines that are different from each other and diverse from each other, but just as exciting to get to know as Mexican cuisine. So I am a huge fan of Mexican cuisine, but I am not Mexican. And so that's what I wanted to start, that's why I wanted to start talking. I know people recognize tacos and enchiladas, and we have Taco Tuesday and all these things, but if you were to ask for fajitas in a country like Cuba, you would probably be slapped when you ordered that, especially if it's from a young woman, because in Spanish that also translates into underwear, into girdle. So we don't even speak the same Spanish. We have the same words, but we have different meanings for the same words. So after writing for that column in the Cary News, I expanded and started writing for national publications and national magazines and newspapers. And that's when an agent, my wonderful agent, contacted me and said, we think you're ready for a book. And my first book was on the discovery of a culinary movement that I happened to fall into in 1996, when I discovered that Southerners were starting to use Latin American ingredients in their recipes, and Latin American immigrants from all over Latin America were starting to descend into the South, a new group of immigrants. We were coming from every social background. We had farmers, we had doctors, we had writers, we had lawyers, we had all sorts of people descending from all 21 countries at the same time into the same territory. That was very different from what had happened in California and New Mexico and the Southwest. Many of those had previously been Mexican territories, and so the cuisines there are Mexican-centric. But here something different was happening. I started getting letters, and this was before we had social media or anything like that. So I started getting my first emails, but a lot of phone calls and letters from readers saying, oh, you know what, I'm putting chipotle in my barbecue sauce. Or I made jalapeno hush puppies. And I started seeing this also in reverse. The Latin American immigrants saying, I couldn't find masa harina. This was in the 90s. Now it's in every supermarket. But we couldn't find masa harina, so we're using grits to make our tamales. And I realized, okay, this is something worth investigating. By the time my agent came into the picture, it was 2007, so 11 years had gone by since I had discovered the movement, and the University of North Carolina Press asked me to write a whole book on the subject matter, and that became my first book, The New Southern Latino Table, where I was able to prove that this was indeed a new culinary movement in the South, and it joined the branches of Low Country cuisine, of Cajun, Creole, etc., that build the tree of Southern foodways. So once I was allowed that entryway into writing at this point in an academic level, I thought that I wanted to write my first entirely Latin American book. It was going to be in academia. Again, it was the University of North Carolina Press. But I wanted to do it from a place of fun, a place where people would not be intimidated with the food. And what better than street food? And so I decided to write Latin American street food, and that has become a very popular book. It just came out on paperback now, because indeed people realized that they didn't need any special equipment, any special kind of cooking techniques or anything fancy to cook fun, delicious, vibrant, fresh, healthy food. And that book allowed me to start breaking the stereotypes. Not all Latin food is spicy. Not all Latin food is unhealthy. Not all Latin food is fried. Not all Latin food is cheese-laden, et cetera, et cetera. And I discovered that everybody was ready to really start learning and digging deeper and deeper into what Latin American cuisines had to offer. So because I live in the South, my next book was Beans and Field Peas, a very Southern dear book to me, also just came out on paperback. And my latest book was Empanadas, the handheld pies of Latin America. That book is now out of print, but hopefully we'll make it happen soon again. But it was a very, very popular book and went into several printings before COVID hit and it went out of print. So I had lived in Guatemala City from the age of 5 to the age of 18 because I was born in Philadelphia. Believe it or not, this accent has a little bit of Philly in it. But having been raised in Guatemala City, I went to the American School of Guatemala, so I was surrounded by Americans, which is what I think made it possible for me to notice that movement when I came to North Carolina and lived with a foot in the South and a foot in Latin America. And I think that's why I was able to discover the movement. I didn't invent it. It wasn't me. It's just something that I happened to notice. But when I was growing up in Guatemala, my father was an oral surgeon, my mother an economist. They were super social. And in Latin America, you truly network through parties. That's how you get your jobs. That's how you know who's getting married to whom. That's how companies hire people. It's through all these social events. So they start really making you a social person since you're a little kid. And in my parents' case, that involved entry into embassies. So because I was a child, many times I ended up in the embassy's kitchen, seeing what was boiling in the pots there and talking to the staff and making friends among all the people there who all I knew how to talk and what to talk about was about food. And I really love food since I was a little girl. At the same time, that involved going to an international school with international friends, of whom many of which were from Latin America. So Argentinians and Chileans and Peruvians, and getting invited to their homes for dinner and realizing, wow, their food is completely different from what I'm getting at home. And all of that started, so from the age of 7 on, I've had this keen interest on cooking. At the same time, my grandmother was known as, before Martha Stewart came into the picture, many, many, many decades before, but she was like the Martha Stewart of Guatemala back in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and you never knew who was going to be in her house. So again, I was a very shy kid, believe it or not. I was very, very shy. And Latin American kids, whenever you go into a party or somebody's home, you're taught to go straight into where the crowd is and kiss everybody on the cheek and say hello to everybody and do a little introduction. This is that part of training you to network. And then you're part of the party. But of course, there were many of us kids there. We were like 28 cousins, so there were many of us. And everybody would go and play and do whatever they wanted. I would hide in the kitchen. That was the place where I felt safe. But there was a rule in that kitchen. There were about, I'm going to say, 6 to 8 staff members cooking meals, because you never knew how many people were going to show up. And this was every single weekend. And the unspoken rule was, you can't be here with idle hands. And so I was 6, 7 years old, and I was already making miniature tortillas because my hands were little and I could shape them small to put little appetizers. I was the one in charge of cleaning the beans, removing all the dirt and little pebbles and everything from the beans. And slowly, as the years went by, I started becoming part of the kitchen staff. And I started participating in making sauces and making pie crusts and making all these other elaborate things because I was there, and I wouldn't come out until it was time to say goodbye and the meal had already finished. I just was so afraid of people. So I was learning a lot there. But at the same time, I had an aunt who was a very famous caterer in Guatemala City from the 40s on until the 80s when she passed on. And she was also a gossip writer in the newspaper. And so it was a great job for her because she would go to, again, this is networking gossip that we're talking about. Remember, this is how people found their jobs and how connections and things like that, social connections and career opportunities. And so she would go to the parties that she catered and she would hear all these things, and then she would have this special, it was called the social column. It wasn't called the gossip column, but it merely was such and such is getting married to such, and he's an engineer, and he's going to be looking for a job in the city, da-da-da-da-da. And it was just fabulous. So when I started writing for the newspapers, I realized that in a way, 2 generations later, I was sort of doing the same thing. The writer and the food had come together into my life, and I felt like I had a special guardian angel there in my great aunt who was watching what I was doing. But throughout all this time, there was this nagging thing in my soul. There was this book that I had in my head. It wasn't a book of obscure recipes. It wasn't a book that was going to be teaching you difficult techniques or difficult things to master at home. It was a book for you home cooks, because I am a home cook. I am not a chef. And I have been teaching cooking now for over 38 years to home cooks just like you. I've taught in cooking schools around the country. I used to be one of the regular instructors at a Southern Season when that was here in Chapel Hill, Williams-Sonoma stores, and culinary schools throughout the country. So I've taught chefs. But I'm not a chef, I'm a cook. Because my inclination has always been to help you become freer in the kitchen, for you to be able to learn how to cook in a fun way that makes it entertaining for you to be in the kitchen, and to take every single intimidating concept out of cooking, because cooking is something that those of us who are lucky to have food on our tables every night, do for fun, and we do for flavor. And so it's so sad when I hear that people say, I have to cook as if it were a chore, because unfortunately we have to cook every day. And I understand that feeling too, because if I were to have 30 minutes a day and somebody would say, use these 30 minutes and you have to create a sculpture or a painting, I'd probably have a heart attack every night too. But there is something else about cooking, and that is that we can cook easily, quickly, efficiently, in a healthy way while having fun and still produce very flavorful food that is good for us. And that was my mission. That's what I wanted to do. And when I first started talking about a Latin American cookbook, a large cookbook in the industry, publishers were really, really reticent to even think of a book this big. They kept saying, too many countries. No, only Mexico is popular. Only Mexico is recognized. And my line to them was, can you imagine if 60, 80 years ago somebody has said only Italian cooking is worth it? We wouldn't have French cookbooks. We wouldn't have cookbooks from Spain. We would have missed on so many cuisines, Portuguese, Polish, etc., etc. You're doing the same to Latin America. Mexican cuisine is fabulous. It's akin to Chinese food in the sense that they've got regional differences and ingredients, and they change by place and state and region and cook. But it's the same in every other Latin American country. But I couldn't get them to open up to that. So it really took about 15 years of knocking at people's doors. And about 7 years ago is when I first wrote the very real proposal. The proposal is your business plan of what a book will turn out to be. And I actually included, don't laugh, 9,000 recipes in the recipe list. And I didn't do this because I think we could publish a book with 9,000 recipes. Like my editor loves to say, we would need a barge in order for us to carry each book had we published a book that big. But it was important for me, for editors and the publishing world to know that I really did know what I was talking about, and that there was really a huge cornucopia of food that they did not know, and someone could teach. And it ended up being a very interesting journey. When Knopf bought the book in four years ago, that's when I started writing the book. And it was very exciting to sell this book to Knopf for many, many reasons. It's a dream for any cookbook author to write for Knopf. They, of course, published Julia Child's cookbooks. If you ever saw the movie Julia, the letter she gets at the end is from Knopf. So that was a dream I never dared to dream, I'll tell you. But it is a dream of every food writer. But also because my editor, my wonderful editor, Tom Pold, when he acquired the book, he said, I want this book to be exactly what you want it to be. I don't want us to tell you what to write. I want you to direct the book and make it what you want it to be for the home cook. Let's aim at your readers, at the people who have come to know you over the years, and let's give them the book you think they want. And the first exercise he gave me was to reduce the number of recipes to at around 300. Now, how was I going to do that? I had to decide, how am I going to present this book to the world? Do I present it by country? Well, no. 21 countries and only 300 recipes would mean about 13, 14 recipes per country. That really does not give us an idea of what each country really cooks like. It's not enough. It's not big enough. But I had that number that I had to meet. So then we went to, how about historical moments, periods of time, the colonial period, the ancient period, the new immigration period, the Republican period, etc. And I said, no, because then it's going to be too heavy in history. And even though I am a food historian, and I always include history in the books because it's how you learn why people eat what they eat today, I didn't want this to be an academic book. I wanted this to be a cookbook. And so we decided that the best way for me to arrange the book was by ingredient. And that allowed me to build a thread, or use a thread, a common thread in all of the 21 countries that allowed me to patch together the different pieces because they're very different from country to country. And so that when you open a book, I could present you with a very beautiful, colorful, different quilt. And the ingredients are those threads that tie all of the cuisines together, even though neighboring cuisines can be completely different from the next one. So let me tell you a little bit of how and why this was possible. I start the book by giving you a very brief, and it is very brief, I think 4 or 5 pages only, of history on the cuisines of Latin America. How did our cuisines develop, and why do we eat so differently? Why will you find a lot of Italian-influenced recipes in Argentina and find people eating gnocchi with tomato sauce every 29th day of the month? And yet Chileans prefer to eat a pasta that's tossed with a fresh avocado sauce. Avocado, which they call palta, because again, we don't all speak the same Spanish. The word for avocado in the Nahuatl language, which is the language of Mexicans, ancient Aztecs, and that later moved through the Mayan world, is aguacatl. But once you cross over into South America, the word changes to palta, and it's a different language, it's a different group of people. So the native languages in our different countries have had an effect on how we speak. But why is it that Peruvians have stir fries with soy sauce and ginger and garlic very much in the same way Chinese cooks will make, and yet in El Salvador you have no stir fries in the menu? What happened? Weren't we all colonized by the same people? So this is what happens. When the first groups of Native Americans are here in the Americas, they're all very different. They're all living in very different, isolated places, and they all have different ingredients that they are domesticating. Tomatoes and potatoes are being domesticated in Peru. To domesticate an ingredient is to make something that is poisonous or unedible, and through changes that you make in planting and etc., you make it edible. So tomatoes and potatoes, of course, are members of the nightshade family, as are eggplants, but also belladonna. And belladonna is one of the most poisonous plants. In fact, if you ever read the book My Cousin Rachel, you've heard of belladonna. That was the poison that she used to allegedly poison her husband. At the same time, the Mexicans were the first ones to domesticate the tomatoes and make them edible, so they had to travel all the way from Peru to Mexico, and the Aztecs were the first ones to make them edible. Corn was being grown all through the Americas. That is the vertebrae, that is the backbone of Latin American countries, the one ingredient that is everywhere in Latin America, which is the reason I chose it for the cover. But when the Europeans arrived to the Americas, they discovered that they could not eat corn the way we eat it now, corn on the cob. It's a different kind of corn. We are now eating hybrid kinds of corn. But your ancient corn needed to be nixtamalized or transformed, again, through a chemical change in order to become edible and in order for our bodies to be able to absorb all of the vitamins, including, and most importantly, including niacin, without which we would get very, very sick. So the Mayans and the Aztecs fight for the rights of who invented nixtamalization. I happen to believe that there were different people in different places, because some nixtamalized with calcium hydroxide that they got from stones and rocks around where they lived, but others nixtamalized with seashells, and yet others nixtamalized with ashes. Nixtamalization is putting your corn kernels in a big pot of water to which calcium hydroxide has been added. You bring it to a boil, then you let it sit overnight at room temperature, and the outer kernel of the corn falls apart. And then whatever you have left, the corn kernel, which is now softened and puffed up, is what you grind into masa. It is what you grind into, it is what you use to make pozoles, for instance, and it is what here in the South is known as hominy. So even though nixtamalization may sound as a very foreign term, anybody who's ever had grits has had nixtamalized corn. So it's not that different, see? When the Spaniards came over, they discovered that they did not recognize any of the flora or the fauna of the place where they had descended. Can you imagine that? All these weeks and weeks and weeks starving in ships, finally finding land, not what you expected to find, and then you get out and you can't recognize a single plant, you can't recognize a single animal. There was no cattle in the Americas, there were no pork, there were no chickens. The indigenous people were eating duck, and they were eating some kinds of deer and even some kinds of dog, not the domesticated dogs that we have now, and turtles and seafood, but nothing that they recognized. And the plants were foreign. They had no idea that a pineapple was edible or that prickly pears could be eaten. Forget potatoes, which were underground. They had no idea what food was, so they depended on the indigenous people to show them what they could eat. And even though they were colonizing and taking over, conquering the territory, it was the same story as in the United States. It was the Native Americans who were teaching them how to survive. But on their second voyage to the Americas, the Spaniards then bring rice, citrus, all the poultry and game that we know, sheep, goat, beef, of course. They even bring horses. There weren't any horses here. And they bring things like sugar. And all of the foods then start combining, and it is the first global exchange of food. We think we live in a very global moment right now. But think if that hadn't happened in 1492, Italy wouldn't have tomatoes. Switzerland wouldn't have chocolate. The world wouldn't have turkey. Turkey is Mesoamerican. And we wouldn't have rice. We wouldn't have chicken. Can you imagine the South or the Americas without any pork? No hams, no barbecue, etc. And there's so many ingredients like that. And so I decided to weave a story in which I would present the ingredients that have most impacted Latin American cuisines from both sides of the world. Because Latin American food is a beautiful amalgamation of all of the different cultures in the world on a plate. And even though the Spaniards and the Portuguese, the Iberians, who first colonized the Americas, the Portuguese colonized Brazil, but the rest was colonized mostly by Spain. They all came from the same area, so they brought the same kind of techniques, culinary techniques, like how to make rice pilaf, which is how to saute your grains before you add a liquid to it so that they can remain fluffy and separate, which they themselves had learned from the Ottomans. With the techniques on how to make barbecue, which is not a Southern invention. Barbecue actually comes, the name, the term, and the technique comes from the Taíno indigenous people from the Dominican Republic, which first cooked meat on a stick over fire and called it barbacoa. And started combining all of these techniques and cooking. So that happens at the beginning of the melding of the world, right at the start of this movement. But when the United States starts getting this huge immigration of the old world into the new world, because Europeans were starving, there was war and famine in other places of the world. The Irish were going through a terrible famine. Ironically, with potatoes that had come from the Americas, right? The potatoes that were feeding the Irish when they had their blight and that destroyed all the potato fields and made them starve, had come from the Americas. But those people started moving into Ellis Island. We all know the story of the United States, and they move into Ellis Island. At the same moment, bigger numbers of the same groups of people were immigrating into Latin America because Latin countries had just gotten their own power. They had just become independent. We're talking about the 1800s into the early 1900s. And they were new countries with very few inhabitants because most of the native people had died from disease, exploitation, all these different things that happened during that period. And they were these new countries that didn't have enough people, one, to work the land, and two, to defend them. Because as we all know, newly independent countries, and in this case they were 21, are very vulnerable to conquests. And they had all gone through 400 years of being under a conqueror, so they wanted to be able to defend each other from their neighbors. And so they start offering visas, and they start welcoming immigrants from all over the world. And different groups of people descend on different parts of Latin America. So there are a lot of Italians that come to Argentina. They fall in love with the terroir. It's a place where they can grow the same things that they could grow at home. It looks very similar to certain areas of Italy, and they descend into Argentina. But also the British. The Brits fell in love with the pampas of Argentina, and they descend. So Argentinian cuisine has a huge Italian influence, a huge British influence in their food. The Germans and many of the Eastern Europeans go to Chile. And so you will find that the modern day food of Chile has a lot of Germanic roots and Eastern European, especially in the pastry department. You'll see a lot of the desserts represented by a lot of these influences. But when you go to Guatemala, which is where I grew up, you find a lot of Spanish cuisine and a lot of Western European, French, Portuguese influences in the cuisine that are not the same that you will find in Cuba, because Cuba was mostly influenced by Spain. Now, there is a third vein that comes into the Americas that is very, very important, that actually confirms the food of all of the Americans and brings it all together. And it's not uncommon to what we have here in the South, and that is the African vein. When the colonizers realized that they didn't have enough people to meet their quotas of silver and food that they had to send back to Europe, they forcefully bring Africans into the Americas and they enslaved them. What made the Americas different than North America is that the Iberian colonizers felt that it was in their best interest to let races mix from the very, very beginning. And so between the Europeans and the Native Americans in each, or the indigenous people in each country, and the Africans, as we start mixing with each other and combining, we also start mixing on the plate. We also start combining our influences and our traditions on the plate. And African influence is huge throughout the Americas. We have a term, the trinity of our cuisines in Latin America, that encompasses a dish where you always have beans, rice, and plantains. The beans come from the Americas. The rice were brought by the colonizers, but the plantains were brought by Africans. And yet, every single Latin American country, from Cuba to Brazil to every single country, has those three things as their trinity of ingredients that are at the basis of home cooking. So this is all the history that I present in the book in a very fun way to demonstrate why we all eat what we eat. There is, of course, a strong group of Lebanese that descend, and Middle Easterners that descend on the Americas, different groups in different areas. You find Lebanese communities in Brazil, and you'll find that they sell kibes in the street, for instance, which is a bulgur and lamb croquette, delicious with pine nuts, absolutely delicious. But they also do the same in the Dominican Republic, because they also had a very big Middle Eastern and Arab influence in their cuisine because of the groups of people that settled there. But you'll also find tacos árabes in Mexico, because there's also a huge group there, and yet the foods that made it to each country are different. And the groups that made it to each country had enough variation in the recipes that resulted from that blending of cultures are completely different depending on what country you're in. And I find that to be fascinating, because we tend to think of the United States, my birth country, also as the melting pot. But here, the melting pot is not truly melted. And And even today, they're trying to divide ingredients. The carrots go here, the potatoes go here, the beef goes there. That's what I feel is happening. But in Latin America, all the ingredients are encouraged to be together. That is a melting pot. And so, as we are at a time when we're celebrating diversity so much, and it's a word that's being used and overused to the point where I think it's starting to lose its meaning, I see Latin American cuisine and the opportunity to truly celebrate diversity through Latin American cuisine in this way. We're all Latin Americans, but we're all different. You will not find the term Latino outside of the United States. It was a term actually coined during the 1989 census for the 1990s, so that we could all put our little mark on a little square and they could box us together into one monolithic group, which we can't possibly be. We've never been that, we will never be that. We're just too different. But so we celebrate our nationalities. You'll meet Salvadorians and Puerto Ricans and Chileans and Brazilians, and that's how we celebrate each other. But we love our differences. We really do celebrate diversity, even though we have a common thread of the traditions that we have from Spain and Europe and the different traditions that we have from the indigenous people. We love to celebrate our differences. And that is something that I ask my readers to do. I ask you to, as you see all the similarities, which are in the ingredients that I've selected for the book, this is the thread that ties us all together. I also invite you to celebrate the differences and to be comfortable doing that. To be comfortable knowing that a pasta dish in Mexico will have chipotle chiles, but a pasta in Peru will have completely different kinds of seasonings, even soy sauce and maybe some molasses and things like that you wouldn't find in Mexican pasta. So what kinds of recipes did I include? I include recipes that are not holiday recipes or anything that you'll need for special occasions. I include what you would come home and make at the end of your day, because I wanted you to know what your modern contemporaries are cooking in their homes now in the 21st century. What are they making? Some of these recipes are based in recipes that started in antiquity. So you'll have the moles, for instance. You know them as moles. Mole means mixture, but you have guacamole, which means a mixture of avocados, and you have your tomato salsas, and you have all these things that come from antique times. They're almost made almost identically as to how they were made originally. But then you have the modern dishes like the one-pot pastas, which we all thought had been invented here in the US, but which Peruvians and Mexicans have been making for centuries, where you actually make a sauce and then drop your pasta into it and cook the pasta in the sauce. One-pot pasta. And I have several of those recipes in the book. What about cakes? Do we have birthday celebrations or just everyday cakes like an equivalent to a pound cake? Yes, we do. And I give you one example of that in a cake that I find fascinating. It's called a quesadilla. But for most of you, quesadilla represents a tortilla that's stuffed with cheese and other goodies. And that's because you're thinking of Mexican cuisine. And the quesadilla cake comes from El Salvador and the northeastern part of Guatemala, where those two countries collide. And it's a pound cake made with rice flour and cheese. So it is sweet savory. It is such an elegant cake. And yet it's a pound cake. You just mix it together in a bowl, stick it in the oven, and you've got this very gourmet tasting cake that you can serve with a plate of fruits and cheese at the end of a very elegant meal. And yet it's every day. We have cookies. Why do Panamanians make delicious chocolate cookies? I actually found this growing up, that a lot of Panamanian contemporary cooks have a lot of American influence because of the relationship that they built with the U.S. during the building of the Panama Canal. And so on and so forth. So you will not find, even though they exist, you will not find the recipe that uses the iguana from Jilotepeque in Guatemala. You will not find that. You will find, though, the recipe that uses turkey. You will find the recipe that uses pork loin. You will find the recipe that uses chicken And most of the ingredients you can buy in your regular supermarket. That was important to me. I wrote this book during the pandemic. And it was a very interesting time to write a book because my husband and I were supposed to go to a 23-city trip. I needed to interview people and to revisit places and to go to universities and talk to scholars, etc. And we were supposed to leave the week after the pandemic started. So the world was shut down for us. And what was I to do? I had all these appointments and things that I needed to go investigate. And Zoom became my saving grace because a friend of mine from Panama suggested that she said, I have this friend who's a chef. He's bored to death. He doesn't have his restaurant open right now. He is willing to teach a class on one recipe that you want to investigate. We can invite lots of cooks to join us via Zoom. Everybody can be cooking together, and you can interview all of them. That was one dish. Well, that became my formula for many, 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 many of the dishes in the book. Others were investigated from manuscripts that start back in the 1500s. I went back through every possible book, notebook, grandmother's recipes that I could from people from all over the continent that would share them with me. And it's a different kind of book because this book is the first international book to be simultaneously published in 2 languages. And it's exactly the same edition. You can put one next to the other and you're seeing the same exact thing on the page. And that is what Knopf did for me. They said, we're willing to publish it in Spanish too. And that was important to me because most Latin American people who learn to cook, we learn this way. Your grandmother saying, add a little bit of this and cook it until it smells like this and it looks ready, and then it will be done. Here in the United States and the rest of the world, we have learned to modify our recipes and actually make formulas out of them. It was important for me that people who live in Latin America from different countries are able to recreate the recipes just as you can. That they can actually make their recipes exactly in the way that they're written so that they can work for them in the kitchen. Because one of the biggest complaints I heard from my students was, I'm a terrible cook. And I would say, why are you saying that? Oh, I've tried these recipes over and over again, and they'd never come out. And I would say, bring me your recipes next time. And they would bring their recipes, and I would say, you know what? It's not you. It's the recipe that's failing you. So this book was actually tested by many, many, many cooks. The recipes were tested first by me after I developed them. And the way recipes came about was I would investigate one dish. Let's go back to the dish that Chef Francisco Castro taught me to make, which was the sancocho de domingo, which is from Panama, and it's a very simple Sunday chicken soup. And I would get 60 different versions of the same recipes. I would find the commonalities, talk to people, find out how they made them, why they did what they did, or why their grandmothers taught them this or that, and then develop one recipe out of that, test it, send it to tasters from that country to test and tell me if that was what they were expecting to get. And then it went out to testers. It went out to regular cooks, and it went out to a professional tester. And each one of them had to take a step-by-step photo of absolutely everything they did in the recipe. It's not easy to test for my books. And then they could not substitute any single ingredient, and they had to follow the recipe exactly as it was written. I even had children test some of the recipes, and they all succeeded. But the last thing I'm going to tell you about the book is that the energy that has surrounded this book from the very beginning was beautiful, because I kept finding that communities kept coming together, even though we were separated by this big pandemic. I had communities of cooks coming together over Zoom. I had communities of people sending me their recipes. I had communities of people willing to talk to me. And the final community, the one that I think sealed the love in this book, was I had 2 weeks in between the pandemic. Do you all remember? We had 2 weeks where we thought it was over, and then we had to start using the masks again. It was during those 2 weeks that we shot all of the photos in the book in my house. The wonderful photographer, Kevin Miyazaki, came, who photographed my book, and I chose him among many because I just loved his work. He came from Milwaukee to my house. We set up a studio in the foyer of the house. And I called a friend of mine and I said, it's impossible for me to cook hundreds of recipes by myself in 2 weeks. Would you be willing to come and help me? She so happened to be the director of the former Southern Seasoned Cooking School. And she said, I'll come. Ellen said, I'll come and I'll help you, don't worry. Well, when she came to my house, it wasn't only Ellen. She had put together a group of 8 of our cooking school friends. And during all of the days of the shoot, they would show up 6 o'clock in the morning. New ingredients were on the table that my husband had amazingly shopped for every day. And we would start cooking. I made different stations around the kitchen. And everybody, I had a friend who came to style. I had my friends who came to cook. And together, we made the entire cookbook. And guess what? We were supposed to photograph 75 recipes, and we have more than 130 photographed. There's 159 photos in the book. And they all got tested again under fire, because we had to produce 12, 13 recipes every few hours so that we could photograph them in a cycle. So all this to say that this book is a labor of love. It's a book that I made for you. It's a book that I hope you will cook from and you will share with people and you will learn from. But more than anything, it's a book that I hope will transport you to faraway lands, invite you to travel and get to know the people, and at the end, show you that we're not as different as we think we are. And that if you love minestrone, you will find a menestra soup in Argentina. If you love barbecue, you will fall in love with the cochinita pibil of Mexico. If you love popcorn, you will definitely fall in love with the food of Ecuador that uses popcorn for all sorts of accoutrements, either on top of soups or to top ceviches. You will find something that you love and something that you're familiar with in each one of these cuisines. And so that the quilt can become evident for all of you, and you can all be embraced by this quilt of community of different groups from around the world, and yet you can find your own place at the table. So thank you for listening. I hope you love this book, and I am ready for your questions.
Thank you so much, Sandra. Do we have any questions in person? We have a couple from Zoom already. All right, let's go for Zoom first then. Martha says, I'm curious as to the sources that say Spaniards got pilaf from the Ottomans, since Spain was under the Arabs and not the Ottoman Empire. Do you have any comment on that?
Spain was under the Ottoman Empire for 8 centuries, and they were Arabs. So yes, that's the connection. It's the technique for pilaf comes from Persia, and all of those techniques went into Spain through the time that they were under the Ottoman Empire, and they changed the cuisine of Spain. If you study and you read on the time of history that we know as the Alhambra, and you read about Andalusia and all of the beginning of the culinary books that start with Le Livre de Saint-Sauvy, you will find all of that explained and all of that illustrated in the techniques that go into Spain and that then Spain will bring to the Americas.
Okay. Ophelia says, I know that African Americans embrace cultural foods in the form of soul food. Is soul food incorporated into your culture? And if so, is there a certain dish that really represents that?
No, soul food, and I have many, many friends who are African American writers and scholars on soul food. Soul food became the food that the Africans in the United States of America formed, rightly appropriated for themselves and built in order to have this sense of community on the plate. That is the best way I can explain it. In Latin America, that didn't happen. There is not a soul food. We have African influences in every single kind of dishes. There are, however, certain countries that have bigger influences from Africa than others. And there is an area in what is the Latin Caribbean and the northern part of Central America, the beginning of South America, Venezuela, Colombia, and of course the Latin Caribbean, which is Cuba, Dominican Republic, and Puerto Rico, that have had a huge African influence in the cuisine. And in Guatemala, for instance, which is not, you wouldn't think, there's a huge influence from the Garifuna people. And these were the Africans that were expelled from the West Indies, and they settled in Guatemala in the 1800s, right before Guatemala became independent. And they brought with them a tradition of cooking with coconut, of cooking with seafood and plantains, all combined in the same plate. And that the Garifunas are actually just one of the groups that have made it throughout the Central American, northern part of Central America, the part that is on the Atlantic side, and you will find their influences there. So what we do in Latin America is we recognize these elements in our cuisine, but it's not as marked as you have it here. And there's not one soul food. There are too many influences in Latin America to be able to break them apart. You do have what I call the Afro-Latino movement, the Judeo-Latino movement, the Italo-Latino movement that represents all that, but it's all part of the whole.
So we know that you have this incredible knowledge of food and foodways and recipes. Is there one that you go to each time you're looking for comfort to bring you that warmth?
I will say that's like asking me who my favorite child is. But yes, I would say I included some recipes, about 12 recipes from my grandmother. They're not all from Guatemala. My grandmother lived in Mexico. She traveled widely around the world. Some of them are very influenced by Cuba, where she spent a lot of time. So those are the ones I gravitate to, like the chicken soups, things like that. But no, there's one actually that the photo you'll see in a moment here that's coming around that every child in Guatemala will recognize the moment they see the photo. Doesn't matter what part of the world they're from. And those are these little toasts, these toasts right here, that are topped with a spinach puree, with hard-boiled egg, and Parmesan cheese. Every child in Guatemala learned to eat spinach this way. I never understood why spinach has such a bad reputation up here when I moved here, because you have got to try this. There's a lot of butter in it, so I know the butter helps. But it's just a magnificent way of learning how to eat something. It's very comforting. You've got the crunchy, the creamy, the hot, the cold, the cheesy. And it's not that different from bruschetta that are served in Abruzzo, Italy, that are made with spinach and egg and cheese, but their spinach is chopped usually and left whole, and of course it has olive oil instead of butter, etc. But that would be a very comforting dish for me. But I think everybody will find comforting dishes here. If you like spaghetti and meatballs, I've got an incredible recipe for Uruguayan meatballs that are to die for. If you like seafood stews, you will find a delicious tapado from Honduras. Tapado means covered. The African word was tapu, which is still used also, the Garifuna word for that. And these are dishes made from seafood, plantains, corn, and vegetables that are cooked in a coconut sauce, coconut base, that are not dissimilar to your low country boils and your low country bisques. So everybody can find their comfort. There's a chocolate cake there for anybody who is craving chocolate like crazy. There's a whole chocolate chapter. There are many recipes that don't include any heat whatsoever, because not all Latin Americans eat chiles. So you'll find a lot of Cuban recipes, a lot of Venezuelan recipes that don't include a single chile, Dominican Republic recipes, so you don't have to be afraid of heat. There are a lot of salads. There's a chapter, I think my longest chapter in the book is the vegetable chapter, because it's one stereotype that we don't eat vegetables, because when you go to restaurants here, you don't find many vegetables on your plates. But we actually have a very vegetable-centric cuisine, because just like in China and in any country where people had to go through a lot of difficulty and strife, even here in the southern United States, your meat became the element that you use to season foods, or the smallest element on your plate, and vegetables were the ones where you could fill up. These are cuisines that are based on the land also. You grew your own vegetables. I still grow my own garden. I grow my own garden. I grow all of my produce except for avocados, which for the life of me I can't grow here, and citrus, but everything else we grow in our garden. I maintain my bed of milpa, which is my corn, my squash, and beans, the three sisters that are at the base of all Native American cuisines, to remind me where I come from and how important growing our food is. So I think that you'll find comfort in Latin American cuisines in different ways, and I invite you to look for those recipes first. The index is very, very clear so that you can find an ingredient that you like and find those recipes. The titles are both in Spanish and in English so that you can discover those that you feel are the ones that you have to take the least leap of faith into before trying than others.
All right, well, you guys, I think we mentioned it, but in case we didn't, Sandra's book is for sale in the shop, and we're actually getting ready to head outside for her to do a book signing. Sandra, thank you so, so much for your time today and for this incredible talk and sharing your book with us. This is awesome.
Thank you for inviting me, and you can find articles on the book also. The Washington Post published a great article profile last week, and the New York Times has one today in today's paper. So I hope you'll enjoy and you'll help me disseminate and desegregate Latin American cooking. Thank you.
And thank you.